Welcome. We're glad you're here. I'm Eric White. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at the library. As you may know, our January theme at the library is Colorado 150, exploring our legacy, commemorating the sesquicentennial of our state. Throughout the month, we are holding talks, discussions, and events related to the history of this land that we call home. In that vein, we are excited to have CU Denver professor Dr. Rachel Gross join us to talk about the history of the outdoor gear industry, especially in Colorado. Before we do formal introductions, I will just make my usual disclaimer, which is that the library sees as part of its job bringing in speakers to share their own perspectives for the enrichment of the community. Speakers' perspectives are purely their own. All right, now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Rachel S. Gross is a historian of the outdoor industry, author of Shopping All the Way to the Woods, How the Outdoor Industry Sold Nature to America, and co-editor of Big Box USA, The Environmental Impact of America's Biggest Retail Stores. She is an associate professor of history at the University of Colorado, Denver, where she teaches U.S. gender, business, and public history. Before I welcome her to the podium, I'm just going to set up our Zoom so that our online friends can see our presentation. So bear with me for one moment. Go. And please welcome Dr. Rachel Gross.
Okay, so I'm mic'd up. Can you also do the lights just in the front of the screen? Thank you so much, Eric. Okay, hi everyone. Today we get to talk about Colorado history, which is a lot of fun, in part because you can already tell from the objects that are up here and from the conversation in the audience that there are a whole lot of people who know from personal experience the history of some of these outdoor companies who've used Colorado outdoor products for their entire adult recreational lives and who might have a whole lot of opinions about what's the good stuff, what didn't work, and have fond or not so fond memories of these goods. So to talk about the outdoor history of Colorado, especially focus on the industry in Boulder in the 1960s and 70s, I first want to go back in time to explain some of the context that I write about in my book so you can get a sense for the larger questions that I'm bringing to these topics before we delve into the area and the time period that a lot of you probably know a lot about. The outdoor industry started at the same time that outdoor recreation became popular in the second half of the 19th century. It coincided with the rise of Americans' move from rural to urban areas, with the rise of industrialization, and especially with the angst that many developed when they noticed that people spent a lot more times at their desks thinking about the outdoors rather than using their bodies to do physical labor or leisure outside. And so an advertisement like this one, which is for some fishing tackle, is a really good representation of the ideals that were a part of the outset of the outdoor industry. Namely, that outdoor products, be it camping gear or fishing tackle, were all about the promise of an outdoor experience that would take you away from everyday modern commercial life and bring you back to some place that's more authentic, more real, and more yourself. And so you can see the desk-bound office worker in the top part of the image, imagining just what it would be like if only he had time and the ability to go away with his new fishing tackle and experience being really himself out on the water. I think this is a good representation of how any history of the outdoor industry has to examine actual objects, right? It's about products that people buy, but it's also about ideas, because this isn't really about fishing tackle at all, right? The image of the beautiful, I can't tell if it's sunset or sunrise, the feeling that is evoked by imagining the escape from the crowded industrial city and the smokestacks goes far beyond just the fishing goods themselves. It's all about the ideas behind them. In my larger book project, I talk about the history of the industry dating back to the late 19th century and starting with now famous brands such as Abercrombie and Fitch. In the early 20th century, Abercrombie and Fitch, which was founded in 1892 in New York City, advertised itself as the foremost outdoor outfitter in the United States. They had a large 12-story building on Grand Avenue in New York City, and each floor was dedicated to different types of products. So there was a hunting floor, a fishing floor, a floor for outdoors women, as well as for outdoors men. On the roof of the Abercrombie and Fitch building was what they called the Davy Crockett cabin, where you could go and kind of experience what it's like to be in the woods, but on a rooftop. They had a little pond that you could go test out boots in or try out your fishing products in. I think this is an important part of the precursor to the story that we're going to talk about because Abercrombie and Fitch and its early 20th century competitors were a big part of how Americans came to learn that they needed to buy stuff in order to get back to nature the right way. The earliest outdoor guidebooks actually recommended something quite different. They said, you better not talk to these shopkeepers who can't be trusted. They're just going to sell you junk. You really need to rely on yourself in order to make everything that you need to stay safe and warm and dry outside. This was the woodcraft ethic of the late 19th century, and guidebooks often taught things like how to make your own buckskin. Of course, it started with shooting a deer, and it ended with you using the mushed up deer brains as a kind of to tan the hide and then dry it out so you could make it into a fringed jacket or pair of pants. I think the kind of quintessential example of somebody who might exemplify this woodcraft ethic, which is definitely one of masculine virility in the outdoors in the American West, would be Theodore Roosevelt, who you see posing here in his buckskin suit, not in the outdoors of the American West, but actually in a New York studio. Part of why this is notable is that despite the ethos of woodcraft, right, the notion that you must make everything yourself in order to be a real, authentic outdoors man, Teddy Roosevelt and his contemporaries usually didn't do that, right? In fact, Roosevelt bought his buckskin suit from a Mrs. Maddox, a probably native woman in the North Dakota frontier. And then a few months later, he returned to pick up his suit, and then he went on to pose in his New York studio for his Tales of a Hunting Ranchman books in out east. In other words, there's a lot of storytelling going on when people buy outdoor products. That's not to say that Roosevelt himself wasn't an outdoorsman or that the people who followed him or read about how to make buckskin themselves weren't also real outdoors people. Part of what I want to point out, though, is that they attached a whole lot of meaning to the notion that there was a right way to get back to nature and that you had to look the part in the right outfit in order to feel the right way. Roosevelt was very eager to look the part, and it was a part of his image first as a politician, then later kind of as a kind of just known and as a national figure. And many other outdoors people followed his example. And so I trace in the larger book this history of the outdoor aesthetic, the notion that there are outdoor products, technologies, goods, things like that, that do mediate Americans' outdoor experiences, that some of them are in fact necessary because I don't actually think anybody should be cold or wet or die out on the trail, but also that people acquire and hang on to because it's useful, but because they love it, because it's a part of who they think they are as an American, as an outdoors person. And those intertwining stories are what this history of the outdoor industry is all about. The history in Boulder and in Colorado more broadly really starts in the post-World War II era. So I'm going to jump ahead to talking a bit about the influence of the U.S. military on the outdoor industry, and then get into 3 different products, a sleeping bag, a backpack, and a down vest that were important parts of Jerry Mountaineering, Holly Bar Mountaineering, and Frostline, 3 Boulder companies that helped define the outdoor industry, not just here, but nationally in the second half of the 20th century. So in World War II, the U.S. military had very little cold weather expertise, and as military officials were looking towards entering the war, they were worried that they wouldn't be able to compete with other European armies that had far better equipment and clothing than them. They turned to the best outdoor experts they knew, and that was people like Harvard mountaineering experts who had been in part of climbing clubs as youths, and then also people who worked in the industry. So Eddie Bauer, the guy, L.L. Bean, Leon Wood Bean himself, Harold Hirsch of Hirsch Weiss, were among the civilians that the military sought out to help advise them on how do you equip an army of millions for cold weather. What they came up with, the layering systems, new kinds of down sleeping bags manufactured in Bauer's factory in Seattle, new kinds of snowshoes and jackets and the like, became objects of lore for many during the war, as they read in national magazines about ski troopers training at Camp Hale and in other places, and also about the kind of amazing feats of many American soldiers. And so, like many other products during the war, outdoor equipment acquired a kind of lore or an allure to it because it was associated with the scientific expertise and testing of the US military and the best experts the military could find. And also because ordinary civilians couldn't get it, right? This stuff wasn't accessible to everyday people. And also, outdoor companies weren't selling the products they had been in the years before the war because they weren't able to access raw materials to manufacture any goods. And so the origins of the Colorado outdoor industry partly have to do with this dream of getting better gear that people couldn't actually buy during the war itself. In the years immediately following World War II, however, Americans all over the country for the first time had access to accessible and affordable outdoor goods. The fine sleeping bags and snowshoes and jackets and tents that were lauded in the American Alpine Journal in 1946 soon became available to civilian markets all across the country as Army Navy stores popped up, not just in jumping off points to the outdoors like Estes or Boulder or the Bay Area or Seattle, but also in small towns all across the Midwest, the South, and other places where people never would have had access to high-end outdoor products. In Boulder, there were a few people who recognized the possibilities of taking all these military surplus products and then reselling them to an eager civilian market. Roy Holubar, who was a math instructor at the University of Colorado Boulder, and his wife Alice were among those who said, this might be a really good idea to buy a bunch of military surplus products and then to resell them to an eager market. Now, Roy didn't serve in the US military, so as a non-vet, he didn't have priority access to any of these goods, so he got a friend to basically buy it for him so he could resell it. He recognized, along with Jerry Cunningham, a young man who had served as a ski trooper during the war and who was eager to return to Colorado to become what he called the L.L. Bean of the West, that there was going to be money in mountaineering. This is actually obvious to a 21st century audience, right? Because we recognize the Western states as big hubs of the outdoor economy. But in 1946 and 47, this was a kind of oddity. There were only maybe a few thousand climbers, mountaineers across the country who would be willing to buy specialized products that people like the Holubars and Jerry Cunningham were eager to make. And so they embarked on these new businesses, at first selling surplus products and then later selling goods they made themselves. And they weren't sure if it was going to be any kind of economic success. In fact, Roy Holubar didn't quit his job teaching as a math instructor because he wasn't sure if he could support his family on the income that was coming in from outdoor products. It was his wife, Alice, who actually led the business. And so in 1946 or 47, the Holubars sent out their first catalog. It was about this big, the size of a credit card. It had maybe 10 or 12 pages, and it listed in just with type, no images, what kinds of goods were available. Almost all of them were military surplus products being resold by the Holubars. But slowly, over the next couple of years, Alice, who was born originally in southern Germany, used her German language expertise to make connections in Western Europe, especially in Switzerland and in France, to begin importing high-end mountaineering products that weren't being manufactured anywhere in the United States. And so in the early years of Holubar Mountaineering, this company started to make its name because they had the best kind of high-end, expensive goods available for people who were climbing and mountaineering. and also because Alice and Roy were themselves outdoors people. So they weren't just selling from their basement on Grandview Avenue in Boulder to people who they happened to meet, but rather they were going out in climbing classes, helping to teach to the outdoor clubs at the university down in Boulder. And through that, they were able to make connections with local folks and then slowly to a national audience. Indeed, Alice Holubar was well known as kind of the genius behind the brand, and soon even people who were kind of the best American climbers, those who'd be asked to go on Everest expeditions and the like, were writing to her personally with the specs of new kinds of jackets that they wanted her to design. In the late 1950s, the Alice and Roy were invited to send some of their best known products, and one of those was the Royal Light for Roy and Alice, Royal Light sleeping bag, to the exposition in Moscow. Now, in the 1950s, during the Cold War, there was a lot of debate in both the USSR and the United States about which economic system was better for ordinary citizens. One of the ways this debate happened, and many of you might remember this from your high school or college history days, was talking about home products, right? For the housewives at home, whose kind of day-to-day experiences were better. And the kitchen debates at the Moscow Exposition in 1958 or 9 was all about Khrushchev and Nixon kind of sparring off on which of the wives had better lives, in the USSR, or where they were seen as equal citizens, or in the United States where they had the highest end kitchen goods, like they had the best washing machine or dishwasher and the like. So in that vein, a lot of the products that American companies sent to display in Russia were about showing off the amazing potential of mass production under capitalism. The Holubars were also invited to display their goods at that very same international fair. Now, obviously, they're not sending anything like a dishwasher or a washing machine that would be on display in a kitchen that would be lauded by the American vice president. Instead, they sent what they called kind of evidence of their family business and craft skill: the sleeping bag, the climbing equipment or the hardware that they had made or had imported, and a tent. They were really proud of these products because they were, again, from a family business, and because they represented what they saw as the particularly American way of getting back to nature, namely spending days or weeks at a time out in the wilderness apart from everyday civilization and finding a true escape with well-made, reliable products. I don't think that the Holubars were really well acquainted with the expertise of Russian mountaineers during the same time, who also had really laudable experiences out in wild places. But nonetheless, they wrote this letter kind of showing off the sleeping bag and other goods as emblems of American craft capitalism in the late 1950s. It's unclear how audiences in Moscow reacted to this display, but what was clear is that somebody swiped all of the goods, so they didn't come back because eventually the Holubars had to file an insurance claim for the $1,000+ that they had lost through that display. What's important also is to note that the Boulder community embraced the fact that the Holubars, their kind of local outdoor brand, were becoming national, and they were really eager to celebrate the fact that they had goods displayed out in Moscow, but also that they were equipping outdoors people in Colorado and beyond. Now, there was one competitor that they had, friend and competitor alike, which was Jerry Cunningham, along with his wife Anne, who also had a company selling outdoor goods, selling high-end products based out of Boulder, Colorado during the same time period. Now, as I mentioned, Jerry had been a ski trooper. When he was kind of being really miserable during the war, he would spend time huddled in his tent sketching designs for a teardrop backpack that he thought would be an improvement on all of the military's junk, essentially, that he was using during the war. It's interesting to think, for me, about the difference between the soldiers who actually use these products and then the really high expectations of civilians who lauded these goods as the best of scientific testing and the American ingenuity during the war. Jerry, Roy Holubar, and others were coming into this business at the same time that new attitudes about the American family were reshaping how people experienced leisure in everyday life. family camping, the post-war kind of road trip, and the experiences that people had with more participatory parenting for fathers all shaped outdoor products of the 1950s and 1960s. A really good example of this is the Jerry Company's Kiddie Carrier. Kiddie, not for cats, but rather for children, is what I'm saying here. This is a pre Jerry Cunningham days. How kids might have gotten around if their parents were eager to get outdoors and still had to lug them along. This is just a wooden pack board or pack frame where the kid has been slotted into a bag strapped to the bag itself. Not comfortable, I think, either for the parent or for the child. What Jerry Cunningham and his then business partner, Meg Margaret Hansen, came up with was a new design of a pack, a children's carrier that used all the newest innovations when it came to transferring the weight to your hips via a very heavy hip strap, so that the kid could have a forward-facing view, be high enough up to experience the same kinds of things that you were seeing, and also that the parent wouldn't get tired after carrying them for multiple miles. So here you have one of Meg Hansen's patents. She eventually her work became so popular that she formed a spin-off company called Jericho that went on to make kids products, not just hiking specific ones, for decades to come. Part of why I enjoy the advertisements from the 1960s for these products is that the pictures are somewhat at odds with what the patent promises this technology would be. I think one of the really interesting things about the descriptions in the patent has to do with the scientific nature of the design of the packs and how essentially this would make it palatable to men who are carrying around their children for the first time, where they otherwise perhaps wouldn't want to be caught being that involved. Whereas every advertisement makes clear that it's probably moms, not dads, who might be carrying the kids with a lot of these packs. I did oral histories, as I'll talk about in a little while, to understand a bit more about Frostline and the do-it-yourself kits history and the gendered components of who made those kits. I've done that less with the early Kiddie Carrier, so I'd be eager to hear people's experiences, including yours with the pack that you brought, about like what that looked like in their lives. Part of what's interesting to me about the Kiddie Carriers of the 1950s and 60s that Jerry Cunningham and Meg Hansen helped to originate is that they became far more widespread than the hiking trail itself. I have friends who use these Kiddie Carriers to take the kids to museums or to walk around big cities, not just to go out on the trail. And I think that's actually emblematic of one of the bigger shifts in the outdoor industry in the second half of the 20th century. That a lot of outdoor products, especially clothing, but certainly equipment as well, became eventually popular style. In the early 20th century, whatever you bought at Abercrombie and Fitch would have been appropriate for the trail or the woods or wherever you were going, but you never would have used it in an urban environment. It would have been odd, inappropriate, or kind of far too casual and misplaced to make sense there. But by the second half of the 20th century, companies like the Holly Bars and Jerry Mountaineering helped to make these products more visible on city sidewalks, in day-to-day life, and eventually part of American fashion, especially in the US West. And I think that the ubiquity of these packs now speaks to that broader trend. I'll move on now to the final product that I'm going to talk about, which is the Frostline do-it-yourself kit and the vest that you see here. This picture is from the Museum of Boulder. You can see that they have on display not just a sewn vest, but also, I think the more interesting thing, which is 2 bags of kits yet to be made. Now, both the Frostline outfits and pieces of gear and the Frostline kits ready to be made but not yet sewn are ubiquitous across the American West, as I found during my research. Dale Johnson is the founder of this company, Frostline. He originally worked for Jerry Cunningham for Jerry Mountain Sports before he quit that job and went on to work for a bank because he thought there was more promise in it. Because again, it wasn't really clear whether there was going to be any money in this outdoor business in the earlier days in the 1950s and early 60s. Jerry Cunningham himself had tried to make a kind of kit to make accessible sewing clothing and gear at home so that you didn't always have to buy these expensive products from specialized companies. But Jerry Cunningham's method and the books that he published related to how to make gear yourself didn't really have widespread popularity. And so Dale Johnson took that idea and then went on to form a wildly successful company beginning in the early 1970s. What he started with was this notion that if you gave customers at home everything that they needed in order to put something together themselves, they could do it over the course of a weekend. And so in these kits, you would find the fabric already cut out to the right size, small or medium or large, the down in nice little tubes that you could push into the sewn together pieces, all the notions that you would need, the buttons or the snaps or the fabric, things like that. And even a really nice little label that said Frostline Kits made by, and then a little place where you could write your name into it. Dale Johnson envisioned these as a way for people to access really nicely made products for half or sometimes 2/3 of the price of the ready-made goods that were already on the shelf. And so these became popular first for outdoor enthusiasts and then later for people who were selling to schools, which I'll talk about in just a moment, who were looking for project for home economics classes. There were a lot of reasons why these were popular. One had to do with the cost, right? It was way cheaper to make this yourself than it was to buy it ready-made off the shelf. Another was that in this era of buying outdoor products through mail order, it also was easier to get access to a Frostline catalog than some of the fancier brands that had ready-made goods that you might order. I think that something else people talk about when they reflect on the era of Frostline kits was this notion of kind of fierce independence and customization that came along with sewing these goods. People liked the idea of being able to do what they wanted with the products, if that's design flourishes or tailoring the equipment to meet their specific kinds of needs. One of the things that I found was interesting when I talked to people who had sewn these kits in the 1970s and early 80s is that they were made for both men and women, but often the people who actually sewed the kits were women for themselves and for their families. And then a lot of the men who I talked to were so proud of what they had sewn. And when I asked them about their experiences, they reflected on their neighbors who helped them do all of the hard parts, or their wives or mothers who sewed most of it for them. And this didn't come across when women were recounting these stories as any kind of critique. I think they were really proud of how they were able to equip their families, not grumpy about it. But it was interesting because it kind of reflected the notion that the outdoor gear companies had a complicated path when they were trying to advertise these new goods to American consumers. They were trying to show that even, this is Hapless Jake is the name of the character in this advertisement for a Frostline kit from the mid-1970s, that even somebody who doesn't have much expertise in home sewing would be able to put one of these together. And here you see kind of his disapproving wife looking over his shoulder, not really sure if she can trust him to do the job well. The letters to places like Backpacker magazine in the 1970s reflected the fact that there was a really wide range of experience when it came to the success people had at sewing these kinds of kits. Some people said, yeah, I can just put one out on my dining room table on Saturday morning, and by Sunday it's done. We're ready to go have an adventure. Another reviewer said, this is a 400-hour jacket, that I had to sew, which reflected, again, that people have really varied levels of skill when it comes to putting it together. Now, I didn't grow up in the era of home economics, and I don't know how to sew a button. So I'd very much fall in that 400-hour kind of end of things, but people's experiences varied. One of the ways that Frostline kits, along with their competitor brands, and eventually there were more than 12 just within the outdoor world that were also selling sew-it-yourself kits, including Brown Paper Wrapper, REI, Ultra, and many others, is that they had a really ready market in home economics classes in junior highs across the United States. Now, some of these junior high activities might have included things like sewing a pillowcase or something like that, or a tablecloth. I think that the industry, the outdoor industry, imagined that this would be a far more palatable activity for the boys who had to take home economics classes. And so a lot of the images showing off how these sewing kits for vests, jackets, sleeping bags, and the like ended up in classrooms showed young men happily engaging in the activities because of the nature of the product, right? Because it's outdoor gear, something functional and required for outdoor activity, it made a lot more sense for them. So the advertisement suggested to be able to sew these things and not feel kind of threatened or undermined by the activity. When I did oral histories with folks who had sewn these Frostline kits, nearly 50 years after the fact, they had hung on to many of the objects that they originally had sewn. This included people like this woman here who had sewn basically sleeping bags and panniers and other equipment for herself, for her husband, and for her entire family. Sally Wright is showing me her Frostline sleeping bag. This was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. She's showing me, and she said, look, it's still just as good 50 years later. And she and her husband were still going out on bike packing trips in the Montana mountains when she was talking about this. So I was absolutely impressed by it. Other folks who I interviewed talked about their 60-40 jackets that they had sewn in the early days of the American West because they couldn't afford to buy any other outdoor product. And one woman, Christy Dubois, brought in her 60-40 jacket and put it on, which again is impressive that she kept it. It still looked great, though it was a little bit faded, and that she was able to put it on. Together, these stories of the early Colorado outdoor industry, the history of Holubar mountaineering, Roy and Alice, and how they kind of helped to originate in their family basement this high-end outdoor company that eventually became a national symbol of American craft family businesses. The history of Jerry Mountain Sports, Jerry Cunningham, and how he helped to originate the design of kiddie carriers that became a part not just of outdoor equipment for many American families, but a part of family gear far beyond the trail itself. And then finally, the history of Frostline and Dale Johnson, how he was able to create a kind of kit that was accessible and affordable for far more Americans than had ever had access to outdoor gear, exemplifies the way that the outdoor industry in Colorado hasn't just had a local influence, but rather a national and sometimes even international one. In fact, there was a work collaborator of Alice Holubar who was traveling in Northern Europe, in Norway and other places, and he wrote her a letter saying, I see your pack and sleeping bag designs in the store windows here in Oslo, right? Reflecting the fact that though perhaps in the first half of the 20th century, American outdoor manufacturers were really on the sideline. They weren't at the cutting edge. They were not leaders in any of these areas. But in the second half of the 20th century, the design innovations and also the aesthetics, what it meant to look like an outdoorsy person, were often originating from places like Colorado and other states around the American West, and then being sold as an image of what it looks to be like an outdoorsy person to the United States and farther beyond. This catalog cover from 1973 for Holubar Mountaineering, which shows the scenery that would be recognizable to many Coloradans, but not necessarily the grandest, biggest mountain or alpine lake that would be recognizable to all across the country, I think exemplifies the fact that it wasn't ambition to be famous that got a lot of these outdoor industry professionals their start, but rather the desire to outfit their friends and their family with the best possible gear that they could find. In the earliest days of the outdoor industry, there was this notion that if you bought anything, you might be doing something wrong, that at least you should examine your motivations and your habits, because any shopkeeper is going to tell you to buy a bunch of junk, and then you're not going to have a true, authentic outdoor experience. By the second half of the 20th century, this notion that buying stuff on the way to the woods was a problem had completely flipped. Instead, outdoor companies, Colorado and elsewhere, were responsible for pushing the idea that outdoors people had to stop at a shop on their way to the woods. That the only way to be safe and warm and dry was to get the very best product that you could with a reputable brand and to wear it for as long as possible. In the rest of the book, I poke holes at some of those ideals as well, right? As I think about the ways that people who don't need necessarily climb mountains, I include myself, I stay lower down than going to the top of the mountains, don't need the best, most expensive, fanciest gear all the time when ordinary products might do. I think about the ways that people's habits as consumers and also as outdoors people change as they get older and have different needs, like making their back or knees hurt less when they're on a trail. And it means that all these rules about the best way to look like an outdoorsy person continue to evolve, right? That there isn't really one shopping list that I could recommend or that you'll find in my book that says, here's the right way to get back to nature. Instead, you'll find a whole bunch of conflicting ideas where some guidebooks or catalogs might say this is the way to look the part and to do it. Others might embrace a far more fashion-oriented style and be really clear about that that's not a problem, that in fact, that's going to welcome far more people to the outdoors in the coming years. So I hope in the next few minutes we can talk about the history of the industry and I can answer some of your questions or hear some of your stories about these companies that you might know really well, keeping in mind that kind of deeper value that I'm not actually here to dictate that anybody should or shouldn't have any of this stuff, but rather to reflect on the fact that there are really deep stories involved in any one of these products. There's a lot of functionality. They have gotten us to amazing places and allowed us to do really exceptional feats. And also, we hang on to these objects because we love what they are and what they represent about who we are and who we have been. And I think paying attention to those stories can help us be critical consumers and also be really careful about who we're including in the story of the outdoors in the years to come. Thank you.
All right. So now we are into the Q&A portion of our program. So I'll call on folks in the in-person audience, and then I'll also alternate with our online audience. And yeah, online friends, as a reminder, you can put your questions in the chat. Should I bring the lights up?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll also say in a little bit when we get to the show off your cool stuff portion of our program, I'll explain a bit about what a pop-up museum is and how we're going to do this. And so if you have questions or want to share kind of more broadly things that you're reflecting on based on what I talked about, I'd love to hear that now. And then we'll turn to the actual cool stuff that you have over here a little bit later in about 10 minutes or so.
All right. Who's got a question?
So with all this talk today about affordability, there seems to be a growth in secondhand sales. A lot of the secondhand shops that are out there, Boulder Sports Recycler, seem to be doing very well. And part of that is because of the durability of these products, but I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Beginning in the 1960s and especially in the 1970s, I see a lot of folks within the outdoor industry reflecting on that very question, right? Not just affordability, but they don't use these words, but the sustainability of selling petrochemical-based products over and over again to people in a way that eventually is going to have a harmful impact on beloved wild places that they actually care about too, right? So it's a contradiction within the outdoor world for sure, because a lot of people who work in this industry, not just those who sell gear, but those who are guides who have other kind of involvement with the tourist economy, also love these places deeply and recognize that our collective actions do have an impact eventually on the places that we love and on our daily lives. So yeah, having a secondhand economy, thinking about the circular nature of some of these goods, and considering what happens if these objects don't stick around forever in terms of what happens when we throw them in the trash, has all been a crucial part of the outdoor industry, especially in the last 15 years. I've attended a few of the outdoor industry trade shows, the OIA, as a judge for like best innovative new products. And I would say that there's two major veins that I see kind of reflecting on that question. One has to do with essentially diversity and inclusivity, and how do we make the outdoors accessible in terms of affordability, a range of bodies, and kind of to a range of people in terms of like economy as much as we can. The other one has to do with climate change, and how do we recognize the fact that everything that we're making is going to eventually end up in the trash or not if we do something about it. So the coolest kind of innovations I've seen around this have been things like, okay, REI or Patagonia sells secondhand goods. I love that. But also kind of companies that are trying to sell patches where you can have a QR code so that if you lose your one glove or hat or nice jacket, somebody can figure out who it belongs to and get it back to you because it's going to have your kind of communication information on there. Other companies are coming up with things like running shoes that they say, you send it back to us and we'll send you a new pair. And part of what you're doing is signing up for kind of paying for the subscription of you wear out this pair, you get your new one, and you recognize that you need to recycle the old ones because they don't have a life that lasts forever. And so essentially planning the waste into the product purchasing is another thing that some outdoor-oriented companies have done. I think there's a long way to go here, but certainly the fact that in outdoor hubs like Colorado, you can easily access used, really nice products, kind of speaks to the potential that we have to make this a broader trend. It hasn't happened yet, and I think the biggest issue is one of scale, right? That even a place like REI struggles to have enough of the right sizes of the right products that people might want to buy used but can't find that way. So I don't have the answer to your question, but I can just affirm that it's a crucial one within the industry that has been a real focus of innovators who are making new stuff now and trying to figure out how to do it in a way that kind of reflects that.
More questions?
Well, you mentioned Frostline as being kind of the affordable model at the time, which is exactly why I made and jackets and snow gear and all sorts of stuff. But there were also, at least in Colorado, a couple other companies, Camp 7, which is the jacket I have, and Downfill USA, which made these massive sleeping bags, and you could buy for about half the price of a name brand. Do you work those smaller companies that didn't grow up to be big Patagonias into any of your research at all?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think after I finished the book and I was working on this other volume that Eric mentioned on the history of big box retail, I came to understand that all these companies that I'd focused, 13 years of my research life on were actually a very small part of the way that Americans buy outdoor gear. That is, since the 1950s, the vast majority of Americans don't go to outdoor specialty shops. They buy at Kmart, Walmart, Sears. I mean, I'm not saying them in the right time order, but Sears, later Kmart, Walmart, and Target. That's where they get their camping products, their sleeping bags, all of those things. And that made sense to me because I knew that I was writing about what essentially has been considered an elite and very expensive activity, and that sometimes has been seen as a niche kind of culture within a broader enthusiasm that Americans have for the outdoor world. Another way of thinking about kind of not those specific brands that you mentioned, but the bigger range of the outdoor economy is that when the outdoor industry's like basically lobbying arm estimates economic impact, they give a number like a couple of years ago it was around $800 billion. So surely it's a bit bigger now per year. But they're counting all sorts of outdoor activities, not just hiking and climbing and camping, the things that I've mentioned in this talk and reference in the book, but also, of course, hunting and fishing, but ATVing or driving for pleasure, like all of these things can be encompassed in federal definitions of what counts as outdoor leisure activities, which means that we have to consider a whole range of outdoor enthusiasts and consumers who don't necessarily get counted in the kind of narrow version of what outdoorsiness looks like that I'm talking about in this book. So I think that your question is crucial. And the fact that I could write for so long, focused on what has become for me, like as a gear lover and outdoor enthusiast, beloved brands or storied ones if they don't exist anymore, and still miss that actually most Americans are not here, right? They're over here in Target buying a Coleman, tent or whatever. I don't think that's a problem. I don't say that as a critique, but rather a reflection of the fact that there is a real depth to the history of the specialized outdoor industry that I write about, and also to a nod to kind of the millions more Americans who buy different kinds of stuff and for very different reasons, but who share at their core a love of the same wild places, but who experience it in different ways.
Other questions?
Thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. What became of the 3 companies you highlighted in the talk?
Yeah. Mostly corporate buyouts by the end of the 1970s. So as a part of the corporatization of the outdoors, a bunch of companies that you will have heard of but don't associate with the outdoors, like General Mills and Gillette and S.C. Johnson, were looking to expand their portfolios, and outdoor companies became of interest to them mostly because it seemed to be growing like really rapidly, which makes sense given the kind of popular like mass environmentalism of the 1970s, the growing audiences here in the market, and also because they were real mail order fulfillment experts. In other words, part of what these companies could do, the Frostline or Hollybar or the like, could do for the likes of Gillette or General Mills is be really good at getting the right zip codes, sending catalogs, and then knowing how to send them products when they send in orders, which is not a small feat, right? So the logistics behind those companies was really of interest. For the most part, all of the corporate buyouts that I mentioned, that's not true. General Mills bought Eddie Bauer and eventually sold it a decade and a half later. Eddie Bauer, of course, is still around in different kinds of iterations. I think that Jerry Mountain Sports, when Jerry got out of the business in the 1970s, he went into a lot of other ventures, including in sailing. The brand was kicked around for a while. It eventually went defunct, but has been revived. And it has nothing to do, really, with the old Jerry brand, but I think you can buy it at Costco. So I think that's interesting to me because it suggests that there's still a kind of allure to the brand name itself, just like Abercrombie and Fitch has in its totally different life as a shopping mall teenage fashion brand, still maintain an audience despite a real pivot from what it originally was. And again, I'm not saying this as though that is a devolution or a problem. I don't think that is a declension narrative where it's bad that people buy their kids' snow pants in the Jerry brand at Costco. That's perfectly fine with me. But rather to say that all of that storied history of this famous outdoor brand from Boulder in the 1970s went on to be something that somebody wanted to buy. The name was valuable even when the company no longer existed. And I think the last I read that Hollybar, the brand, was also brought up by an Italian company, but I'd have to check to know for sure.
Oh, I'll tack on to that.
What do you got?
I looked at the Hollybar website, and it's from what I could tell, it's basically a site for a boutique store in New York.
Okay.
That just looks like more lifestyle stuff.
Yeah.
That's what I saw.
Yeah. Oh, and I will say Gillette was the one, the razor company was the company that bought Frostline. I think within 2 years, they had run it into the ground and it went defunct. And that's not Gillette's fault. I don't really care about fault as a business historian. That's not really the question as much as what is the broader economic and social context that made that happen. So that's what I was interested in. And essentially how people within the outdoor industry talked about that rapid decline was that, sure, Gillette didn't have outdoor experts at the helm, which is true for a lot of these corporate takeovers. But more than that, shifting of American manufacturing overseas to Asia meant that Americans could all of a sudden buy goods off the rack for far cheaper prices than they could buy a sewing kit that they had to make into a vest. So economically, it no longer made sense. At the same time, and this was an anonymous corporate executive who said this, so I don't know exactly what to make of it, but he said it was women's lib that meant that women no longer were willing to sew for their husbands and sons all of this outdoor gear. And that's why you have thousands of Frostline kits unsewn still in people's attics. Nothing that I found suggests that that's true, but certainly shifts in notions of kind of what's valuable to learn at school meant that Americans learned how to sew. I don't know, tens of millions of people knew how to sew in the 1970s, and that number has drastically declined in the 70 years since. So in the 50 years since, and that's to me, not a problem. I'm not trying to sew anything. I don't have that craft inclination. But I think understanding the decline of these companies is partly not about did the corporate leaders do something wrong, but rather what else is going on in the American economy and social world that leads to shifts in how people want to consume or spend their time.
Well, I would just piggyback on that because I'm someone who continues to sew.
Sure.
But two things happened. You're correct. People got to a point where, oh, I don't want to pay for the kit because I can buy it cheaper. The other thing that happened was the cost of the materials. Like if you're to go buy something and make your own pattern, that began to exceed the rack price. I used to sew suits, for example. Well, there was a point where it flipped and it's like it's cheaper to buy the suit than to buy the Pendleton fabric and sew it. And then people got into their careers and didn't have the time.
Right.
So I think there were multiple reasons.
Other questions?
Go ahead.
Well, actually, my question had been the one about what happened to the company. Answered that. You bring us up to the later period, what happened in the decades following the fall of those companies.
Sure. Yeah, so the last couple of chapters of my book are about the ways that outdoor clothing became popular style, especially in the 1980s. So if you want to trip down nostalgia lane, reflecting on the rise of preppy styles, led by LL Bean, Eddie Bauer, and other outdoor companies, as well as kind of non-outdoor oriented companies like Lacoste, that's part of what I was really interested in understanding is how does it come to be that on a college campus, outdoor brands are ubiquitous, even if you don't need the stuff, but people want it. And that shift is really fascinating to me because I referenced a bit that it would have been an oddity to wear outdoor clothing earlier in the 20th century for everyday life. But my favorite anecdote about this is a young man named Erwin Strohmeyer who lived in Berkeley, California, who wrote about the camping trips he and his mother went on. And he described how she would wear in the 1920s her camping suit, which is, you could imagine essentially like World War I style riding pants made out of canvas and a matching kind of tight Norfolk jacket. She would wear it happily for their camping trips, but she would always change before she came back to town because she didn't want her neighbors to see her. Which to me is remarkable because it's not that the problem was going camping or having specialized goods, but rather that it was an inappropriate outfit for city life, right? That it would have been inappropriate for her kind of in performing her like gender identity and her social identity to wear these grubby camping clothes and have her neighbors see her. Now, people are delighted to go buy coffee and wear their like athleisure clothes and be like, I don't know, I could be climbing a mountain later. You don't know, right? The ethos around like what people are eager to show off about their bodies, their athleticism, their leisure activities is really quite different than 100 years ago. So that was the question that I was asking when I was thinking about the end of the 20th century. Like, how did we get to this point where this is just what I wear every day, even though I'm not doing those things? I also looked, to answer that question, to hip-hop fashion in the 1990s. A lot of hip-hop artists and the magazines and kind of music videos that went along with their music helped to popularize puffy down jackets, Timberland boots, and a lot of other things that, again, became a part of kind of urban style, even though it was far removed from a hiking trail. And that, to me, was a really interesting shift because it also expanded outdoor companies' notion of who they were selling to, right? Not so much the kind of ideal core rugged outdoorsman that Leon Wood Bean's grandson, Leon Gorman, who was the head of the LL Bean company during the preppy era, talked about. He's like, we don't want to sell to those suburban women. Let's just focus on the real men who actually do outdoor stuff, right? A decade later, that would have really been an unthinkable attitude because the market for outdoor products for non-outdoorsy people was so huge and it really was irresistible. So today, and dating back to the 1990s, the outdoor industry professionals talk about what they call the 80-20 rule, that really 80% of the clothing that companies manufacture is used for something other than what it was originally designed for, and 20% is used for the specialized outdoor activity. I am responsible or guilty for this, as one of many, millions of American consumers, depending on your attitude about if that's a good thing or not, or neutral. But I think it does reflect the notion that part of the end of this story of the outdoor industry in the end of the 20th century has to do with the fact that outdoor clothes are part of everyday American fashion. And I'm not saying that because I think I'm fashionable, but rather that it's become a ubiquitous part of what people wear in a college classroom, to the workplace, and beyond. And I think that's really notable because it means that outdoor culture has become a central part of what it means to look American. I mean, what you know if you've traveled elsewhere and say, gosh, everyone else is dressed a little bit more formally than Americans do here.
Any other questions? I'll ask a quick question. Did you, as part of your research, did you walk up to the front door of the former Holubar house and ask to see the basement?
No, I didn't bug the people, whoever might live at 1256 Grandview. But I did make stops at kind of outdoor stores and headquarters all over the country. The research was at first haphazard because a lot of corporate archives are not open to researchers because there's not always a business reason to let academics come look at their history unless there's a really clear regard for heritage, or essentially company history, as a selling point and how they market themselves. So a lot of places just said no, and so but some places said yes, and I was when I was trying to understand the history of Kelty and Sierra Designs, they were owned in 2012 when I was doing this research by American Recreation, and they had a warehouse in Longmont. And so I went just off of the diagonal to like a warehouse, and so a guy was like, here's like this back closet with stacks of binders and junk. You can look at whatever you want, which for a historian is actually like a real dream because, to have access to, essentially, they weren't internal company records, but more like PR catalogs, other publications, or kind of things that they were pushing at retailers and how to sell their goods. But it's a real treasure trove when historians encounter ways of telling history with documents no one else has looked at yet, or no one's looked at with the eye for understanding their past. And so a lot of what I found were things like that, where I got through, essentially cold calling a way in because somebody was eager to share a part of that history. And I think it's something that I'll carry forward with me as a researcher, is that there are always folks who want to recognize like what I'm doing here is actually really important, and no one has asked these questions, and they should be. And to me, as a researcher, that's a real gift.
Thanks. All right, I think that's a good place to end. So we'll get to our pop-up museum in here in just a second, but I'm going to come up and do a few thank yous and a quick announcement. Rachel, I want to thank you for coming up and joining us and bringing your expertise. I want to thank all of you for joining us with your great questions. I want to thank the Friends of the Library Foundation for supporting everything we do. One upcoming program you might be interested in: on Monday evening, CSU professor Dr. Michael Childers will tell the story of how Denver became the first and only city to bid for an Olympics and then reject it. So how that happened and what the forces were at work there, how they might still resonate today. I'll send an email to everyone who registered with a quick survey. Let us know what you thought of the program. And that's it. Have a great afternoon, everyone. And now we will get to our pop-up museum. Online folks, thank you so much for joining us.